start, and I'm going to start passing out the docs for tables while I pull up the PowerPoint and start that. So I won't put them on every table since not everybody's here. But today we're talking about corporate culture, governance, and ethical leadership. And the case study that I had in here is one that I like to use. It was actually used in a previous edition of the textbook, but I'm actually going to talk about, since we just had our internal sales competition and we use Love's products, I was going to talk about Love's a little bit and how the corporate culture there is one where everybody seems to be pretty happy that they're working there. Johnson & Johnson is another company that has, for many, many years, until they got into sort of a ethical controversy with the prescription drug and opioid crisis, was viewed by most people as being a highly ethical company to work for. So the culture that we have at a company has a lot to do with how the company will behave and whether or not you're going to end up with things like SEC fines and criminal charges. So corporations, again, I think I've mentioned this in the past, that politicians get into trouble when they actually say things that are true. And people were asking Mitt Romney when he was running for president about corporations and corporate taxes and things like that. And he said, corporations are people, my friends. And all of the reporters laughed. And that's true, right? Corporations are people. And one of the things that can happen is they can be charged with, crimes. What happens when a corporation is charged with crimes? Well, they don't go to prison. You can't put the corporation in prison, right? So what happens to them? They end up paying usually huge fines. And of course, there's a lot of ethical concern with that, because do they actually pay? Do corporations pay? One of the things that we can debate, and one of the areas, for example, that's controversial, is the corporate tax rate. Corporations, and a lot of people say, they're not paying their fair share in taxes. But do corporations actually pay taxes? If they pay taxes, who ultimately pays the tax? Who?
Us.
How?
I mean, are we not buying their products?
That's exactly it. Yeah, you get a duck. That they pass on that burden to the consumer ultimately, right? So when corporations are fined, who ultimately pays the fines if the corporation doesn't go bankrupt? The Trump organization is being charged civilly by the Attorney General of the state of New York, and she's going to file a lawsuit claiming that they've engaged in all these unethical and illegal practices. And it appears, and this is again not a political statement on my this is just a statement of fact. She is bringing civil suits against the Trump organization and various officers of the Trump organization in their official capacity as officers and directors of that organization. And ultimately, if the Trump organization stays in business, who's going to bear the cost of those fines? And she's seeking hundreds of millions of dollars in fines. Well, they'll have to raise rent on Trump properties or raise fees that they charge at Trump golf courses in order to cover those losses, probably. So is it fair to bring these charges against corporations themselves and hold them criminally or civilly responsible? Well, I think one of the things that we want to look at in this course is, how do we avoid getting to that point anyway? How do we avoid? And I think having a good corporate culture is one of the ways that we can have assurance that our corporations are going to act ethically and above board and follow the law. So what we look at in this is we look at the first two parts of the SWOT analysis. So marketing is the only, and this should come tripping off your tongue by the time you leave my class, is the only fully integrated function of the firm. And what does that mean? Well, marketing seeks to ensure that all aspects of the firm are adding value to our customers, clients, constituents, whatever it is that we have. So it's not just businesses that engage in marketing. Organizations, governments engage in marketing. I used to be the vice mayor in the city of Guthrie, and we engaged in marketing with our citizens, right? We tried to get them to take advantage of the services that the city offers and, pay their utility bills and things like that. That's all part of marketing. So organizations engage in marketing. Well, two parts of the SWOT deal with the internal relations, that's strengths and weaknesses in terms of what we look at. So our strengths and weaknesses are going to play into our corporate culture and our corporate governance. So we're going to look at strengths and weaknesses. What are some of the strengths that the corporations have? What's an ethical company? Well, for a long time, Johnson & Johnson was viewed as one of these companies that had a very high standard, and largely it was as a result of their credo, which I will pull up and read to you. Here. We believe our first responsibility is to the patients, doctors, and nurses, to mothers and fathers and all others who use our products and services. In meeting their needs, everything we do must be of high quality. We must constantly strive to provide value, reduce our costs, and maintain reasonable prices. Customers' orders must be serviced promptly and accurately. Our business partners must have an opportunity to make a fair profit. We are responsible to our employees who work with us throughout the world. We must provide an inclusive work environment where each person must be considered as an individual. We must respect their diversity and their dignity and recognize their merit. They must have a sense of security, fulfillment, and purpose in their jobs. Compensation must be fair and adequate, and working conditions clean, orderly, and safe. We must support the health and well-being of our employees and help them fulfill their family and other personal responsibilities. Employees must feel free to make suggestions and complaints. There must be equal opportunity of employment, development, and advancement for those qualified. We must provide highly capable leaders, and their actions must be just and ethical. We are responsible to the communities in which we live and work, and to the world community as well. We must help people to be healthier by supporting better access and care in more places around the world. We must be good citizens, support good works and charities, better health and education, and bear our fair share of taxes. We must maintain in good order the property we are privileged to use, protecting the environment and the natural resources. Our final responsibility is to our stockholders. Businesses must make a sound profit. We must experiment with new ideas. Research must be carried on. Innovation, properly developed, innovative programs properly developed, investments made for the future, and mistakes paid for. New equipment must be purchased, new facilities provided, and new products launched. Reserves must be created to provide for adverse times. When we operate according to these principles, our shareholders should realize a fair return. That's a pretty powerful statement of ethics and beliefs, isn't it? So when we talk about culture and we talk about corporate governance and we look at these things, where does this come from, do you think? Is culture something that bubbles up from the bottom? Is it organic, or does it come from the top down? Let's think about UCO's culture, for example. We have a culture here. What do you think the UCO culture is? As students, what do you think what do you get the feeling of as students here at UCO? What do you think our culture is?
As students?
As students, what do you think the culture is here at UCO? Why is it that you chose to come to UCO?
Come here to get.
Why did you come to UCO? There are lots of colleges. This is not Wyoming. So I was fascinated by this. I went to the University Sales Center Alliance, which is the body that accredits sales programs, and we have a sales program here. So I went to the annual meeting, which we have to go to in order to maintain our accreditation. And one of the people that was there was from the University of Wyoming, and I did not realize this. I had no clue about this, but it sort of makes sense. The University of Wyoming is the only, he told me, is the only university in the entire state of Wyoming. So if you want to go to school in Wyoming, there's one place to go, and that's it. That's certainly not true here in Oklahoma, is it? You can't throw a rock and not hit a university. Just here in the metropolitan area, you have UCO, you have Oklahoma City University, you have Mid-American Christian University. Really, OU is part of the metro, right? Norman is part of the metroplex of the greater Oklahoma City area. There was a time when Norman was sort of on its own down there and you had to drive. When my first boss here on campus was a kid growing up, Norman was a distance from Oklahoma City, but that's no longer true. The metroplex extends from Guthrie in the north, and if you go all the way to Guthrie, my hometown, there's just housing development the entire way up I-35, up Sooner Road. There's just housing development after housing development after housing development. So the metro extends from Guthrie in the north to like Purcell in the south, which is just south of Norman. It extends from about Shawnee in the east to, I don't know, Yukon or Mustang in the west. That's sort of the metropolitan statistical area. In that area, we have OU. We have OU Health Sciences that's, got a campus basically downtown. We have UCO. We have Mid-American Christian University. We have Oklahoma Christian University on Memorial here in Edmond. So we've got two here in Edmond. There's Southern Nazarene University in Bethany, which is part of the Metroplex. If you count Shawnee as being part of the Metroplex, there's Oklahoma Baptist University there. I'm probably missing some. Oh, and then we've got, of course, all of the two-year colleges that you can go to, right? There's in Midwest City, there's Rose State. In the western part of the Metroplex is Redlands Community College. Oklahoma State has a branch campus in Oklahoma City, and they actually offer more than just two-year degrees now. Then there's Oklahoma City Community College, or OCCC. I'm probably leaving off some others that I have failed to mention. Why'd you come to UCO? Why'd you come to UCO?
Good price and.
Good price and.
The sales is exactly what I wanted to do, and this is the top sales program.
Okay, so we have the only sales program. If you want to do sales, we've got the only one. OSU is starting a sales program, but they don't have a major in sales. They have a certificate program in sales. So if you want to do sales, we're the only game in town. We're the only game in the state, right? There are other states that sales are much bigger. One of the reasons that we went to Utah for this USCA meeting is that the oldest sales program in the country is at Weber State. They started their sales program something like 60 years ago, which is incredible. But all of the Wisconsin schools, for example, have big sales programs, but we're the only one in Oklahoma. That's different. That sets us apart. What else do you think is like a reason that you came here? Now that you're here, what would you say the culture is that's different at UCO than say OU, for example? Anybody gone to OU? You went to OU?
Not like attended, but
I mean, I live on OU campus, so.
You live on the OU campus. You live on campus.
Yeah, my girlfriend goes to OU.
Okay, all right. What makes OU different than UCO in terms of the culture?
I feel like it's a lot less inclusive with everyone around.
You think OU is less inclusive than UCO, or UCO is
In a
less
way,
inclusive?
yeah. Just
Okay.
'cause it's not individually, like you can't really go talk to a freshman whenever you wanted to. As UCO, you could whenever you wanted to.
Yeah, that's true. I went to OU when I started undergraduate, and I think I've told you all this story that, my first professor basically said, I'm not here to teach you. I'm here to publish and to write a book and do all these things. He's still there. It was not exactly a warm and fuzzy feeling that you got. Whereas you come to UCO and we don't have graduate assistants teaching classes here, by and large, on the whole. There are a couple. The English department has historically in the past allowed some graduate students to teach sections of English comp because there's just so many people that have to take it. So that's different. The culture here is that you're going to have a professor, not a graduate assistant. That's a different culture. As a result of the fact that we have, no PhD programs, we don't have a doctoral granting, research has historically been less of a focus at UCO. We want you to engage in research in your discipline, but it's not, as Dr. Hertzke at OU told me in my first class, I'm here to publish. I'm not really here to teach you. That's certainly not been the culture at UCO. What else do you think is part of the culture here that's different than, say, OU or someplace else, OSU?
really liked the student to staff ratio.
Student to faculty ratio, yeah, is a lot lower here at UCO than it is at OU or OSU, where they have a huge, number of students. We're largely, one of the differences that you probably noticed since your girlfriend goes to OU and you live on campus is that we're largely a commuter campus to this day. I mean, we have dorms and we have apartments here on campus, but still the vast majority of our students drive in and drive off. They come here, they get their coursework, and then they live somewhere else, right? And that means that there's a different feel. You have less activities on campus, or at least a lot of our students feel that there are less activities. I don't know that that's true, but you maybe don't have that connection that you have. It's certainly true if you go to OSU, where they have, one of the things that I think makes OSU unique is that it's a pretty small town and it's not really close to anything. Norman, as I've suggested, is really just part of Oklahoma City now. I mean, there's a bit of a difference in terms of the culture that Norman has compared to the rest of the Oklahoma City metropolitan area. It's got somewhat of, this feel that the university is a big anchor there that's different than it is in Oklahoma City. But at OSU, my brother went to OSU for undergraduate, and there was definitely, that whole community sort of revolves around that campus. It's the largest employer, it's got all these students, and there's nowhere else for them to go. They are integrated in the community in a way that maybe our students are not necessarily integrated in the Edmond community, right? When my first boss on campus, when I was in the office of the legal counsel, was an attorney, and he's from Guthrie, which is one of my hometowns. And when he was growing up, Edmond was smaller than Guthrie. And then they desegregated the Oklahoma City public schools, and Edmond boomed, and Guthrie stayed the same. Guthrie stayed at about 12,000 people, and Edmond boomed. So this became a bedroom community for Oklahoma City. And the culture in Edmond has largely been defined by people live in Edmond and they work in Oklahoma City, right? The traffic count suggests that on Broadway, that people go to work in Oklahoma City. Lots of doctors. My brother's father-in-law is a cardiologist at OU. He's a very famous cardiologist. And he lives in Edmond. You know, they wouldn't live around the med school in Oklahoma City because, you know, when he started years and years and years ago, that was a really bad area of town that OU Medical Center is in. Now it's sort of getting regentrified, but you know, the culture in Edmond is largely one of a commuter neighborhood. You know, I mean, people, they live here, but they work somewhere else. That's a little different than what you'd get in Norman. So is this culture, is it something that develops from the bottom up? Is it organic? Or is it something that develops from the top down?
Probably aspects of both. How you
Okay.
mentioned, you know, when they desegregated the schools, that caused Edmond to boom. That was a top-down thing that was, you know, caused by regulations changing.
Right,
But
so they,
also-
when they desegregated the Oklahoma City public schools, they went through busing. And so people moved. They just moved out of the district, right? They just moved to Edmond, and Edmond, boom. So you're saying that that was a government regulation, but it was an external factor. So if we look at the SWOT, opportunities and threats are factors that are outside of it. And those can impact our culture, and that certainly impacted. Edmond was a sleepy little town that was, you know, it was no different really than Guthrie in terms of Edmond, when my boss was growing up as a kid in Guthrie, one of the biggest clubs and one of the biggest activities in Guthrie and in Edmond at the time in their high school was FFA, Future Farmers of America. And lots of people belong to that. If you went to Edmond's 3 high schools now, I would suggest to you very few people are probably involved in FFA, the way it would be if you went to Weatherford or Clinton or Hinton or, you know, some of these other smaller, Alva, Oklahoma, which has a college, Northwestern Oklahoma State University, right? So this external thing happens and it influenced the culture because Edmond went from being this little sleepy town to overnight being a pretty good sized city. And now I think the population of Edmond is, if it's not at 100,000, it's close to 100,000. Let's look here. Edmond, Oklahoma. Population, see it, like pulled it right up on my phone. It was listening. It's 93,101. So just shy of 100,000 people. That's a huge amount of growth in a very short period of time. Now, Oklahoma City is experiencing a rejuvenation and lots of people are moving back to those areas in Oklahoma City that they moved out of because people now want to live in something that, I mean, that has got more character to it. So that's part of the culture that's developing. I think initially, at least with most businesses, culture initially is started from the top down. Management at Johnson & Johnson comes up with this credo, but it continues and it grows and it builds from the employees and people that we hire. When I used to do training, so I used to, as the Office of Legal Counsel, I would go every semester to all of the academic departments that were hiring people, and I would talk to them about how to do a legal hiring, right? How to avoid getting us into trouble with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission by engaging in, you know, hiring practices that are not legal. And I would follow in liberal arts, the dean over there was a woman whose name was Pam Washington. And one of the things that I liked that she said was, when you hire somebody, be very careful. Because you can divorce, she would say this, you can divorce a spouse, but if you give somebody tenure, it's forever. It becomes very difficult to take that away. And departments can change. With one or two hirings, you can see radical changes. And so in the attitudes of a department, in what is valued in a department. One of the reasons that we got a sales program at UCO is we had a faculty member who was adamantly opposed to having a sales program because she thought that it wasn't an academic program, it's a vocational program. And when she left, she was a huge influence on the department. The department changed and was able to get a sales program because she was just absolutely adamant that we did not need to be teaching sales, that was a vocational thing. So you can have both. It can be a combination. You get a duck, by the way, grab a duck, of both this sort of organic movement and movement from the top down. Initially, when a business is started, the corporate culture is probably going to be set by the dominant leadership in that business. But over time, as corporations age, that can change. And with a big corporation like Johnson & Johnson, they started out with this wonderful credo. And, something happened with management at the top, and in many respects, some people think that they have abandoned that, or they at least got off track. So corporate culture, what is it that we're talking about here? Well, it's these beliefs that we have. What makes up the corporate culture? When we look at culture, and we look at various things, right? Just like the United States has an overwhelming culture, parts or aspects of various locations in the United States also have their own unique culture. So we're a big country, which is different than a lot of other countries in the world, in that, our country spans from the East Coast to the West Coast. We're on 2 oceans. And what would you say are some of the beliefs that we hold dear as Americans that make us unique and different? One of the things I talked about that I told you, when I used to teach American national government, I had students write a paper called My American Dream. This thing keeps going off. And the American dream is deeply ingrained in the American culture. And it's largely, one of the aspects of that dream is, I want to own a home. No matter where you are in the United States, outside of New York City, people want to own a home. And even in New York City, they aspire to own their condo. Even there, even though that's out of reach for most people. I used to have a business that recruited nurses. And our business model was, we recruited nurses from Canada to come to the United States and work in American hospitals. And because there's a nurse shortage, we were able to recruit a lot of nurses from Canada. Now, most of the nurses that we recruited were not native Canadians. We took advantage, we had a niche market that we took advantage of. So Canada and a lot of countries in the Caribbean are part of the British Commonwealth. Until very recently, the Queen, who's now deceased, was the head of that Commonwealth. She was the sovereign. Now Charles is the sovereign of those countries like the Bahamas and Jamaica and Canada and Australia. Well, what is this Commonwealth? Well, when we look at corporate, or when we not look at corporate culture, but when we look at, for example, national culture, we have, because of our founding fathers' fear of a centralized system, we originally started out as a confederation. And at the other end of the spectrum is what you call a unitary government, right? And in the middle of these two is a federal system. The British Commonwealth is really a confederation. There are these independent states, and they recognize as their head of state the sovereign of the United Kingdom, largely because they were settled by the British. And so they maintain this kind of league of friendship. Why is this important? Well, because as part of that league of friendship, basically, it means that it's easier for you to travel within that Commonwealth and gain citizenship. So there are all of these nurses that come from the Bahamas and Jamaica, and those countries don't necessarily have great pay for nurses the way we do in the United States. And they can get to Canada and get Canadian citizenship fairly easily. And then once they're Canadian citizens, because of something called the North American Free Trade Agreement, they can come across to the United States. Now, why would they want to come across to the United States, and where did they want to go? Well, what's Jamaica like? What are the Bahamas like? Those are tropical, like little paradises. What's Canada like? It's not a tropical paradise. It's like a freezer. And so you have these nurses that have gone to Canada, and now they're freezing to death because they can make more money in Canada, but they can make even more money in the United States. And so they want to come to the United States. So that's what we did. And one of my partners in this business was a woman who was much, much older than I was at the time. I started this business with another partner who was younger than I was, but I was in my late 20s. He was in his early 20s. And our partner in New York was in her 60s. And she'd done healthcare recruitment for a long time. So we'd go to Canada. We would go to these career fairs for nurses. Most of our hospitals that we represented were in Florida or South Texas, which is closer to the climate that these people want to be in than Canada, which is, like it's snowing already in Canada, and, the leaves are turning, and, we've still got fairly nice weather here in Oklahoma. So these nurses wanted to come across, and they could do that because the Confederation allowed them to get Canadian citizenship fairly easily, and then North American Free Trade Agreement allowed us to bring them across to the United States. So we have, in this country, different cultures. We have this American dream, which is I want to own my own home, which is completely different than in most countries. And even in New York City, this woman that was my partner, her dream had been to buy her apartment that she lived in, which was in a co-op. And when she came to visit me the first time, she stayed at my house, and she's like, how many millions of dollars? She had paid $1 million for her apartment. She'd bought her first home as a New Yorker when she was 62 years old. It was less than 1,000 square feet. It was in a high rise, but it did overlook Central Park at the time. This was in the 1990s. And she came here, and I lived in Edgemere Park at the time. And I had, I think, 7 lots. And I had this home that was like 1,900 square feet. It had 3 bedrooms, 2 full baths, a formal living room, formal dining room. It was an older home. So it had these, and it had all this woodwork in it and the Pullman ceilings and all of it. She's like, how many millions of dollars did you have to pay for this? And I was like, I paid like $110,000 for my house in Edgemere at the time. And she couldn't believe that. That was just, that was crazy to her that you could get all of this stuff. So that's a difference in the culture, even from New York City, where most people don't have this idea that they want to own their home. But for the rest of the United States, most people, that's their goal. They want to, this is part of our culture. It's part of the things that we value, is we want to own our own little plot of dirt. What makes us different in other ways as a culture in Oklahoma from, say, New York as a whole? And there's a whole state, by the way, that's outside of New York. Although New York City, New Yorkers don't think of upstate as like the only place to live is Manhattan for them. That's all they think about. What else is different from New York in terms of their culture? As Americans, we all say we salute the flag. We tend to be overly patriotic. That's different than most other places in the world. There's not necessarily as much patriotism in other places. What else makes us different from New York as a culture?
I guess they're a lot more upbeat.
You think they're more upbeat?
Yeah,
What do you mean by that?
as in like constantly doing stuff.
Okay, it's the city that never sleeps.
Yeah.
That's, you can get another duck. That's one of the things that is different about New York than Oklahoma. Restaurants and bars and things like that tend to shut down and the sidewalks roll up at 10 o'clock.
Also a lot more diverse people over there.
There's a lot more diversity in New York City than there's like, you can find people from every country, and you can find people from every country probably in Edmond or in Oklahoma City, but you're gonna have to look a lot harder than you are in New York, where there's, like just tons and tons of people that have moved there from other places. So yeah, I think there's more to do, there's more happening. What's another big part of our culture that's different than New York City? Almost nobody drives themselves in New York City. They have great public transportation and they take public transit. It's odd to see little kids in the morning in New York City getting on the subway by themselves to go to school. And Oklahomans would just be horribly afraid that, like your kids are gonna get kidnapped or something like that. And we didn't do that. So our culture largely revolves around the automobile in this part of the country, which is different than it is in New York City, where they have this great, access to these resources. So these beliefs and expectations that we have, symbols are important in developing a culture. What are the symbols that we use? So for example, Southwest Airlines, to this day, one of their symbols is the heart. They're the love airline. Let's see if I can pull up Southwest. To this day, they still use this heart as part of their symbol. And Southwest is one of these companies that has developed a very successful corporate culture. It's different than every other airline. The flight attendants on Southwest and the gate agents and all of those people actually seem to like their job. I had to fly United to Salt Lake City for the USCA meeting. The flight attendants were grumpy, the gate agents were grumpy, and there's a guy who's written a whole book called United Breaks Guitars. He watched them break his guitar as they were loading it. He was sitting there looking out the window of this plane, United plane, and his guitar, he's a musician, is going on, and he watched them break his guitar, like right in front of him. Southwest is a different corporate culture. And a lot of it revolves around these symbols, this idea of the heart, and that we're the love airline. So these symbols become enormously important. The way we communicate becomes important. The expectations that we have in our companies, these core values. In a book called Built to Last, Successful Habits of Visionary Companies, Collins and Parias talk about these companies. And the most successful companies have deeply held core sets of beliefs. But one of the things that they found in doing this research were that those core beliefs didn't necessarily have to be good. Philip Morris is one of the companies that they talk about in their original edition of this book. What does Philip Morris produce? Anybody know? Nobody knows what Philip Morris produces. They're a tobacco company. They produce cigarettes. And the executives at Philip Morris were described, the CEO was described as being ruthless and adamant in his belief that he saw nothing morally wrong with producing a product that people didn't need. There's a big difference between producing a product that people don't need and one that is actually harmful, right? Cigarettes, it's not just that you don't need tobacco, it's actually bad for you. There was a movie that came out years ago called Thank You for Smoking, and it was based on the real culture of the tobacco companies who spent millions of dollars at the time trying to do research that showed that smoking, that there was no correlation between smoking and lung cancer. It's not just lung cancer that smoking causes, right? It causes heart attacks, other respiratory problems, COPD, emphysema, and there's a lot to suggest that it not only creates lung cancer, but that it can cause other types of cancer as well in people that use it. So it's not just that you have core values, it's that what we want from an ethics standpoint is that these core values are good values. In a seminal work called Marketing Myopia, Professor Levitt talks about one of the things that leads to corporations that are successful in the long term is that they don't develop a corporate culture that becomes myopic. And what does he use as an example of this? Well, if you went back to the beginning of the 20th century, some of the largest corporations in the United States were railroads. And it's not that railroads are not important today, but a lot of those companies went broke because they focused on being railroads. And what happened? They were myopic. They didn't see the forest for the trees. They were myopic in their outlook, in that what they should have been focusing on was not being necessarily just a good railroad company, but being a good transportation company. That was one of the major ways that you moved goods at the beginning of the 20th century. In February, what do we celebrate? What's the holiday that's celebrated? It is in February, I think, right?
Valentine's Day.
It's Valentine's Day, right?
Yeah.
It's the number one, I hate that holiday, by the way.
I do too.
I absolutely can't stand it. But it's the number one, the largest day of flower sales, and not just flowers, but roses in the United States. We grow a lot of roses in Oklahoma in February. No. What is Oklahoma like in February? It's cold and dry and overcast and rainy or snowy. So where do we get all of these roses in Oklahoma in February? They come from South America. How do we get them to Oklahoma in time for our Valentine's celebrations in February? They're flown in. If you're focused on a railroad, railroads are not going to get the roses to Oklahoma in enough time for them to be at all, by the time you put roses on a railroad in South America and get it to the United States, they're going to be dead. So they focused on being really great railroad companies when what they ought to focus on is being good transportation companies. and moving into that. Into, rather than just focusing on a limited purpose, moving into the transportation industry as a whole. So culture and ethics. How do we ensure that we have good values? Well, a lot of it depends on training. And one of the things that Southwest does as a good example of this is they do a lot of training in their culture in terms of something called living the brand. People who work for Southwest love Southwest. They live the brand. It's not just a job for them because they're trained well. They know what their job is. And part of that training is not just focusing on the specific tasks that you do, but it's introducing you to that culture. It's not just about passing out peanuts and serving drinks and making sure that you're safe, in the air. It's also about passing on those ideas that the company wants you to emulate. So training is important. Having an ethical climate where employees know that there is an expectation of ethics. And the empowerment of employees. In instilling these kinds of virtues and habits and character in that training becomes really, really important. How do you do that? Well, good leadership versus ethical leadership. What's the difference between good leadership versus ethical leadership? Are they mutually inclusive terms or are they mutually exclusive terms? What's the difference between good leadership and ethical leadership? Let's think about these two terms. Most preferred and preferred by most. Are those the same thing? You're shaking your head, no. Why is most preferred and preferred by most not necessarily the same thing?
Most preferred could be like what brands are putting out there, and preferred by most is what people are actually choosing over.
Okay, all right, you can get a duck. So let's think about, I don't know, little kids. I went, and when I was a little kid, you get all your shots. If you did a poll of little kids and said, do you want to get your shots? Most of those little kids, are going to say what?
No.
No, shots hurt. Needles hurt. I didn't want to get shots when I was a little kid. That's not fun. All of your nerves are really, really, active and wonderful. Little kids, for example, how many of you remember this when you were a little kid? You wanted the trays that had everything divided. You didn't want your food to touch. Do you care if your food touches now as an adult? No. Why is it that little kids, because their taste buds are really, really sensitive? And so they, when I was a kid, I did not want any of my food to touch, and I didn't like a lot of stuff on it. I wanted my hamburger to be plain and dry, and I didn't want it to touch the mashed potatoes, and I didn't really want gravy on my mashed potatoes. Potatoes are my downfall. I love all things potato, and I don't like candy, but I like mashed potatoes. But when I was a kid, I didn't like gravy on the mashed potatoes. Now that I'm an adult and I've had years of destroying my taste buds, I like mashed potatoes with gravy. And as you get older, you want all of your food mixed up because that's how you taste stuff, because your taste buds aren't as strong. So little kids, if you ask them, do you want the shots? They're going to say no. I mean, I would be willing to bet that 99% of them are going to say, no, I don't want a shot. But if we don't get the shots, we have things like, measles, mumps, rubella, that, you know, are bad diseases that we've largely eradicated. And so it's what's most preferred as opposed to what's preferred by most. Good leadership versus ethical leadership. You can be an effective leader and not be an ethical leader. An effective leader is one who gets people to do what they want them to do, but maybe not necessarily ethically. So we have types of leadership. So contingency theory, theory X and theory Y. One theory basically says that people are inherently lazy, I think that's theory X, and they need to be motivated by punishment primarily. If you don't meet your sales quota, I am going to fire you, right? The other theory says that people like inherently sort of are motivated and want to do a lot of what we view as our identity is wrapped up in the work that we do. A lot of, you know, what we are as human beings is what we do for a living. So much so, and so much so in the United States, that what's the first question people ask you when they meet you?
What do you do?
What do you do for a living? That's the first question. And why do they ask you that question? Is it because they care about you? I tell students, I'm, you know, harsh reality here. No, it's because they can instantly peg where you are on the social spectrum, right? I mean, there's some panache. And to this day, my mother doesn't tell people that I'm a college professor. She's very proud of the fact that her two sons are lawyers. And that's what she tells everybody. My sons are lawyers. And I'm like, Mom, I'm a college professor, right? I'm like, I have this PhD thing. But my mother started out, she went to college and she wanted to become a lawyer. And her mother said, no, you got to get a teaching degree because you'll always have a job if you get it. So my mother became a teacher. And then she instantly decided that she wanted to make a lot more money. And so she quit teaching and she started a business and she's owned businesses ever since. And when I became a teacher, my mother said to me, you know, Grant, those who can do and those who can't teach. That was sort of her opinion of teacher, right? Is that if you can do it, you're doing it. And if you can't, you teach. She's very proud of the fact that I'm a lawyer and the fact that my brother's a lawyer. So that's what she tells everybody. And people instantly know if you say I'm a lawyer, you know, they instantly know these things about you. That A, you're pretty well educated. Because in order to become a lawyer in the United States, you not only have to go and get a bachelor's degree. What percentage of the population has a bachelor's degree? About 25%. Finished. About 50% of people who graduate from high school attempt some level of post-secondary education. Now, that may not be college. It could be VOTAC or something like that. But they attempt some form of post-secondary education. The days of being able to graduate with a high school diploma and go out and get a good job are long gone, right? So you know something instantly about a lawyer. You know that they have more than a bachelor's degree. It's actually a doctoral degree, right? And most people know that. You have to go to law school to become a lawyer. So you automatically know that this is somebody that's kind of educated. What else? Well, historically, lawyers made a lot of money. That's no longer true. Lawyers come out of law school with a lot of debt and they don't necessarily make a lot of money. But historically, when I was a kid growing up, if you said, I want to be highly successful and make a lot of money, your high school guidance counselor was going to tell you to do one of two things: become a doctor or a lawyer. One of those things is still true. If you go to med school, your chances of becoming a high income producer are still pretty good. If you go to law school, it's not so good, I don't think anymore. But anyway, people ask you this question and it automatically pegs you where you are on the social spectrum. And that's part of our culture. So you can have highly effective people that can motivate people. One of the things that lawyers are generally good at is public speaking, because it's drilled into you in law school from the first day in law school. And one of the reasons that I changed the way I taught classes, I used to be like every other professor at the undergraduate level. The first day I would go over the syllabus and we wouldn't do a whole lot else. That's not the way law school works. The first day of law school, you're expected to have gone and gotten the syllabus and read the syllabus before the first day of class. And there were some of my classmates who didn't. All of my uncles and everyone in my family are lawyers. So I knew that this is what you did. You went, you picked up the syllabus weeks before law school started, and you showed up and you were prepared, because what they do is they say, Mr. So-and-so, Mr. Aguirre, tell us about Barron versus Baltimore. And if you couldn't stand up and argue what this case was about, the professor said, you're excused for the day. And you were thrown out of class. And there were some people that just didn't get that. I didn't get called on the first day. I got lucky. But it's a rude awakening. And they will ask you these questions about these cases over and over and over and over again until you're not able to answer. And at that point, the professor is going to say, when you're in front of a judge, your client just went to prison, or your client just lost if you can't answer that question. And so lawyers are good at talking. You become good at this in law school. That makes us, in many instances, effective leaders or good leaders a lot of the time, but maybe not necessarily ethical leaders. Lots of lawyers have, which is one of the reasons that the code of professional responsibility for lawyers is really thick, because maybe we're not necessarily ethical leaders. Lots of lawyers, for example, are good at charismatic leadership. What is charismatic leadership? Well, fascists are generally charismatic leaders. They're effective leaders. Hitler got a lot of people to do what he wanted them to do, but most of us would say that wasn't ethical leadership. A type of leadership that looks a lot like charismatic is transformational. What's the difference between charismatic leadership and transformational leadership? Transformational leadership is one that focuses on the employee or focuses on the follower. They want what's best for the follower. They are oftentimes very charismatic people who lead these kinds of organizations, but fundamentally what they want is different. Charismatic leaders oftentimes focus only on their own needs and desires. Some societies and some businesses have paternalistic leadership. What do you have in paternalistic? Well, it's a child-parent type relationship where you're going to give the instructions, and it's sort of the strict father model of leadership. Then there's pragmatic leadership. What is pragmatic leadership? Well, oftentimes what happens is with pragmatic leadership, you have people that are forced into leadership roles that didn't necessarily intend to be in those roles. And so they take sort of a incremental approach or a pragmatic approach to the leadership. You can also have caring leadership. And one of the topics in this is one of the ones that I don't really like. It's called servant leadership. And the reason I don't like it is because servant leadership has become code in a lot of companies for we focus on a Judeo-Christian tradition. What kinds of leadership should we strive for? Well, we want both good leadership and ethical leadership. We want people who are fundamentally capable of motivating their employees to do what they want, but they also practice ethical leadership in society. They focus on things like the Johnson & Johnson Credo. There are companies that focus on that kind of service to their not only shareholders, but the stakeholders in society as a whole. How do we do that? How do we build these cultures that are like Johnson & Johnson used to be? And I think to a greater extent, they will come back to that kind of leadership? Well, it starts with our mission statements. And it's important that these mission statements actually match what it is that you are wanting to do. So, for example, Bombas and Tom's have mission statements that give back to the community. They engage in this one for one. You should also have a code of ethics and statements of value. And a lot of things will determine whether or not these codes of ethics are effective and whether or not these values are important. How can we look at that? Well, does the corporation that we belong to have an ethics hotline? Is there a corporate ethics officer? And is that person empowered? One of the things that a lot of companies historically, after Sarbanes-Oxley did, and they were required to have a corporate ethics officer, is they put that office under the office of the legal counsel in some instances. What's wrong with that? Why should your ethics officer not be under the office of the legal counsel? What's the job of a lot of people look at this and they say, look, lawyers go through a lot of ethics training. That's one of the things that you have to take an entire semester class in legal ethics and professional responsibility. So let's just put it under the lawyer. Well, lawyers should have good ethics, but fundamentally, what is a lawyer's job to do if they're a lawyer for a corporation or an organization like UCO? Their job is to protect the entity. And oftentimes, the protection of the entity is in conflict with what is necessary, with what may or may not be ethical. So do we really empower, when we look at these things and we look at corporate cultures, do they empower those ethics officers? Do they provide them with the resources? Are they in the C-suite? Or is it something that is just lumped in with somebody else's job? You're as part of HR, you're the ethics person. Again, HR is not a wonderful place to put these. Why? Because HR's job is fundamentally to do what? To ensure that workers are working and fire people. And a lot of times, the people who are blowing the whistle or creating or bringing problems to the forefront are not necessarily the ones that are rewarded. Well, that's a good place to stop. If you've got ducks, come and see me. And we will meet again next Tuesday. And I will attempt to have your exams graded. It's the time of year when I have a lot of grading, so I take things as they come in, and I had a lot of article reviews in my other classes come in, but I will hopefully get the ethics exam. You all did take the first exam, right? So I've got to grade the essay. And I sent out that email about don't freak out because it automatically grades. The only thing it will grade are the multiple choice objective portion of the test. I have to grade the essays by hand. All right. Let me end the live stream. And I will